Hello and welcome to another video in Foundations of Maternal and Newborn Health. In today's video we're going to be talking a little bit about twins. So there are a few different ways that you can get twins from the embryo. Of course, you can see I've drawn out some of the situations here, and we're going to walk through how you get twins and the different types of twins that you can have. So the first situation where you have twins is you actually release two eggs. So you have two different eggs here, two eggs, and each egg gets fertilized by its own sperm. So two eggs and you have two sperm. And so basically what's happened is that you've gotten pregnant twice at the same time. You've released two eggs during a period of menstruation, and both eggs have been fertilized by sperm. And so these eggs go on to develop into blastocysts, and we've talked about the blastocyst before in a previous video. And just as a refresher, each blastocyst has its own inner cell mass, which is this mound of cells here in the middle, and they'll have their own trophoblast. So around the outside is the trophoblast, and it goes kind of all the way around. I've just drawn it kind of semicircle here. And the trophoblast becomes the placenta, so they're kind of the frilly bits here. This is when it starts developing a little further. I haven't shown any of these images before. And each baby gets its own amniotic sac, so that's drawn in here, has its own amniotic sac. And as it continues to develop, each baby has its own placenta, and its own amniotic sac. And so there's a naming convention based on whether the twins have their own placenta or their own amniotic sac to themselves. And so in this case, each baby has its own placenta and its own amniotic sac. And so an amniotic sac, you might guess, is amniotic. Amniotic refers to the amniotic sac of the baby, and we say that it's di if there are two. So di means there are two. So each baby has its own amniotic sac here, so they're diamniotic twins. And when we're referring to the placenta, we call it chorionic. And of course, again, there's two, so it's dichorionic. And chorionic here means placenta. So amniotic means, of course, amniotic sac. That one makes a little bit more sense. It's amnio. And chorionic means placenta. And di, again, means there's two. So if each twin has their own placenta and their own amniotic sac, then these twins would be called diamniotic, dichorionic. Okay, and so this is the only way you can have twins if you have two different eggs and two different sperm. But you can also have one egg and one sperm. One egg and one sperm. One egg, one sperm. That can split into two babies. And so if this egg splits very early on, if this embryo splits early, so we'll say splits early, then it'll be like there are two eggs and two sperms, and it'll go along this pathway and become diamniotic, dichorionic. It'll form two different blastocysts. They'll implant separately. They'll each get their own amniotic fluid or their own amniotic sac and their own placenta. If the egg or the embryo splits a little bit later, so splits later, you actually get a single blastocyst. So there's only one blastocyst, there's only one trophoblast around the outside, but there are two inner cell masses on the inside. There are two inner cell masses. So you can see here in orange, there are two mounds within the one blastocyst. And this blastocyst will go on to create two babies, but they'll share one placenta. So you can see the frills of the placenta on the outside here, but they each have their own amniotic sac. So this will turn into the amniotic sac and the baby will grow inside of this. So again, they each have their own amniotic sac here. Each have their own. But there's actually one big shared placenta. So this would be mono. Mono means one. So mono means times one. Monochorionic. So one placenta. But again, we still have two different amniotic sacs, so this would be diamniotic. Okay, so these twins would be called monochorionic diamniotic or diamniotic monochorionic. And this is one possibility of this one egg, one sperm twins. If the egg splits even later than in the monochorionic diamniotic, so it splits very late, so we'll say splits very, very late, then we still only get one blastocyst, but you can see the two inner cell masses, they actually start to sort of merge together. They merge together. So they still have, one trophoblast all the way around them, all the way around the blastocyst, but the inner cell masses, they start to overlap. And so where it develops into an amniotic sac, this area starts to be overlapping. And you actually end up with one big amniotic sac that's growing two different babies. And again, we still only have a single placenta feeding both babies. So again, one big placenta. And also only one big amniotic sac. Okay, so maybe pause the video and try to guess what you think these twins would be called. Okay, so hopefully you came up with monoamniotic. Again, amniotic means amniotic sac, and mono means there's only one sac. And we also have only monochorionic because we only have one placenta shared by both twins. So these twins would be monochorionic, monoamniotic. Okay, so there's a few other things that I wanted to note here. If babies come or twins come from a single egg and a single sperm, these twins are known as identical twins. Because they're genetically identical. They have a single sperm and a single egg, so these babies would be identical. For the twins that came from two eggs and two sperms, these are two completely different twins, so this would be non-identical. And that's because each egg was fertilized by its own sperm. This is basically getting pregnant twice just at the same time. So each egg would be different, would have its own DNA, and each sperm would have its own DNA. And so, for example, we talked about this in the genetics video, but the dad kind of decides what the sex of the baby is, and the sperm can either be carrying an X or Y chromosome, and this sperm could be carrying an X or Y chromosome. And so in non-identical twins, you can actually have a male twin, and a female twin. And that's not to say that every time it'll be one male, one female, but non-identical twins can be different sexes. Whereas identical twins, these ones are going to be same sex every time. Same sex, because you only have one sperm with either an X or a Y chromosome that splits into two babies. So it can only be the same sex twice. So if you have a mother who has monochorionic twins, then you know that the twins are identical twins. If the twins are diamniotic or dichorionic, you don't know if the twins are non-identical or identical, unless they're a different sex, in which case you know that they're non-identical. But if they're the same sex and they're dichorionic, then you won't know if they're identical or not until you do more genetic testing. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to talk about was actually conjoined twins. This is very, very rare, but it's basically another possible outcome of the identical twins. But this is if the embryo splits extremely late. And here we had some overlap of the inner cell mass, but in conjoined twins, you have a lot of overlap of the inner cell masses, and the babies end up attached at either a foot or an arm or the back or even the head, and the babies are actually attached to each other. And so those are conjoined twins. Conjoined. And this is extremely rare and very dangerous for the babies. But this is another potential outcome of twins, but we won't really talk about conjoined twins very much because it's so rare.